I get to teach the spiritual wellness right before lunchtime. So that means it's time to sleep, I think. In the academy, I also typically teach economic crime. So you see, they only pick me for the exciting stuff. But I'll try to keep this as unboring as possible, and then I'll also try to tell you a little bit of my story, which my story is going to be different than your story when we talk about things like spiritual. But if you'll bear with me and try to not make this feel too much like church, and we're going to talk more about just our inner being and who we are as a person. So, as just mentioned, I work for the sheriff's office. I've had the privilege of getting to work there for going on 10 years now. I've been able to do a variety of things in my career, primarily in investigations. And what I love to do is teach, as those of you who have had the privilege of teaching are here today, a couple of you. And so I really enjoy coming back to the academy. And I'm currently a sergeant in our property crime group. So that is currently what I do. In 2019, I decided I wanted to do something more, though. I wanted to get back to my true passion is writing. Speaking is maybe not necessarily my thing that I'm the best at. I'm much better at the written word than the spoken word, but I thought, you know what, I want to get better at it. So in order to get better at it, what better way than to put myself out there and decide I'm going to talk into a microphone, which, by the way, is much easier than talking to a group of people, in case you're wondering. So in 2019, I started this podcast, and I'm just going to give you, this isn't really the crux of what I want to talk about, so I'm going to make this really quick, but it became a podcast, a loss and a journey, because in 2019, at the district that I was working at, one of our deputies took her own life. And that happened in early 2019, shortly after I'd started the podcast. And it really gave me my why, which is a little bit about what I'm going to talk to you about today. It gave me my reason for why I was doing it. So if the definition of a podcaster is one who podcasts, then I'm a sort of podcaster, because with my full-time career, I put out episodes as I'm able. But I encourage you to check it out. It's on the blue line, and you're welcome to grab any of the things on that back table with a little eagle on it. These are all stickers. There's some magnets. There's some coffee, which you can't go wrong with that. And I encourage you to listen. There's about 100 and some episodes out there, and more will be coming as I'm able. But as you're learning today, the focus is our wholeness, right? It's a holistic approach to this career. So if I solely did that, I wouldn't be able to do these other things that I'm teaching you today. So that's a little bit about the podcast and how it started. So late in 2009, I came to a group of us and said, I have this great idea. I want to put together this Academy Resiliency Training. And I'm telling you, this is phenomenal. I wish I had this when I came through. I hope you're learning. I know it's a long morning. I know it's Saturday morning. I know you're exhausted. But I hope you're picking up a little bit from every instructor that you're hearing from, because these tools, the little things they mentioned, those little nuances of schedule and so forth, I was like, that's great. And then 2020 happened, and it kind of fell apart. I don't know about the rest of the world, but I know in my life and in my world, 2020 was kind of a disaster. So it probably was for most of you in the room here. And I found even in my podcast, what do I talk about? What do I tell people? How do I tell people, hey, this is a great career, and do this and do that and learn these things, when I don't even know if I want to be a cop anymore? Like, the whole world's falling apart. And in case you haven't been paying attention, 2021 is not going much better. So we go through these, and we all have these difficulties. And of course, what I'm talking about here is on a global scale, but we go through these difficulties and these hard times, all of us in our lives, no matter what we are doing or what we've been doing. So when we talk about this idea of resiliency, what is that? You know, I want to quickly define it, because hopefully in the context of what you're hearing today, this will give you some idea. So it's the capacity to recover quickly from difficulties or toughness, or the ability of a substance or object to spring back into shape, elasticity. In other words, it's like a rubber band, right? You can stretch that rubber band, but at some point it needs to get back to its original formation. It needs to be able to bounce back. You notice in the definition, it doesn't say anything about there not being difficulties. In order for there to be resiliency, there has to be difficulties, because that's what gives you the strength to recover. That's what molds you as those tough times. So then, what do we mean when we're talking about the idea of spiritual wellness? Well, that's where I want to be clear that this isn't religion or religious. Now, I am going to tell you a little of my story, which, as you're going to hear, was in the church. So there's a little religion in that, but that's not what I'm talking about. What I'm talking about is values. It's your beliefs. It's your purpose. It's that inner core of who you are as a person. It reflects a positive attitude towards life. It's faith. So when we talk spiritual wellness, it's that which helps change the impossible things to possibilities. You know what it really is, and I really got thinking about this a lot in 2020 and 2021, it really is hope. Because without hope, why do we do anything? You know, it's that core of who we are. It's the hope for tomorrow. And again, I'm not talking religion. Maybe you follow the path of the Buddha or the Dalai Lama, or you're into Ayurvedic healing or whatever it is. That's okay. That spiritual wellness, that internal part of yourself as to hope for tomorrow or hope to get through whatever we've been through. But again, I'm going to start with my story, which is obviously a little bit more. So, God doesn't exist! I screamed, and I marched out into the Florida heat. It was early May 2003, and I was angry. I was in my early 20s. I know, I don't look that old. No, just kidding. But I was in my early 20s, and I was angry. And I was angry at God. And the reason that I was angry that day, this is a picture of my grandfather, great picture, I know. Reminds me of his sense of humor. My grandfather, my hero, my mentor, the person I wanted to emulate, the person I wanted to be like more than anybody else, had passed away. And he didn't just die. He got cancer, and we've all had it in our families, and we've all gone through it. And he got skin cancer. He got melanoma skin cancer. And the cancer began to eat his face, and he went and he got it treated. And the treatment was radiation. And the radiation began to eat away at his face and do on the outside of the body what cancer typically does on the inside of the body we never see. And it slowly would eat away his face, so much so that in the last year prior to his passing, fire rescue would come out there and believe that he had been the victim of a shotgun blast to the face. Something I wouldn't understand then, and not until years later when I would go to scenes of a shotgun blast to the face and realize what that looked like. So here he was, he died, I marched outside, and I yelled, God doesn't exist in my family. And you might be thinking, well, you know what, for me, I question if he exists anyway. You know, I'm an atheist or an agnostic, and that's fine. But I need to then tell you a little bit of my story and why this was such a pivotal moment in changing it. So here I am, much younger, with my grandparents. So I grew up in the church. I grew up in a small town in northern Indiana. I went to a small Baptist school, and if anyone who's familiar with independent fundamental Baptist, you are in church. My mom wants to make sure that you are in church every time the doors are open. Which for a Baptist, that is Wednesday night, Sunday morning, Sunday night, and if you're in the Christian school, that's Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, and of course youth group on Wednesday between school and service, and Saturday is witnessing day. So it's 7 days a week, and that was the world I grew up in. From my earliest memories, I would be running the van route, and I would have adults and kids in the van, and the Newmans would drive, and I'd be going through games and songs and telling stories and doing things for people going to the church. As I got older, it would be being part of the bus ministry, same thing, just more people. And then as I got even older still, in my teenage years, on those Wednesday nights between school and service, I would be preaching in nursing homes. So that was the world I grew up in. I'm not the same person I was then, but that is the world that I grew up in, and that was what I believed. And here I am in my early 20s, and I'm saying, this was a luau, by the way, so forgive the close. I was saying, what is going on here? Why is my faith being questioned? And it took me back. It took me back to a time not long before that in my teens, where a good friend of mine, Yolanda, I had to go time and time again to the hospital with her as her 8-year-old brother would die of brain cancer, and I'd watch his head swell. And even then, I questioned my faith, I questioned my belief system, and I just didn't get it. And then here we were, there's one last part of this story that you need to understand, and that was that I come from a family that believed my grandfather had been healed before. Again, whatever your beliefs are, maybe you don't believe that's impossible, but we had believed it. Years prior, he'd been working in the basement in Fort Wayne, and he was downstairs, and in those days, obviously, a lot of your power tools don't have any kind of protection on them. They weren't safety-oriented. And he had backed into a bow saw, and the saw had actually cut through his arm, through the tendons, and into the inner sheath of the bone inside his arm. And we believed he'd gone to the hospital, and the doctors were like, listen, we're going to put you in a cast, but we're not going to work on those tendons right now because it went through that sheath, and because you have this damage to your arm, we're afraid that you're going to end up with an infection. And because of that infection, we need to be able to go back in and treat it again later. So he did not have full use of his hand, and his arm was in the cast. He ends up down in the Carolinas, very long story. A family friend, Bernita, ends up praying for him. Again, regardless of what you believe happened, my family believed a miracle happened. And he recalled saying that there was a heat when her hand touched his arm, and he recalled it. He goes back to the doctors when he gets to Fort Wayne. They take the cast off, and they never again had to do surgery on that arm. It had completely healed, and he had full use of it, and it appeared to have an old scar when they pulled the cast off. So again, regardless of what you think happened, my family believed that. So here we are having a crisis of faith, right? And that's what I want you to understand, because you're going to, in this career, and I'm telling you, I've done it in these 10 years, you are going to go to that call with that infant who is now deceased, and you're going to ask yourself, how is it the people that were supposed to protect this infant aren't doing their job? And now I'm here and this child is deceased, and I've got to work this investigation. You're going to go to the bloody and bludgeoned individual who of no fault of their own is now injured or in the hospital. You're going to go to those calls, and you're going to start questioning things. You're going to go to those children that have been abused, again, by the very people that were there to protect them. You're going to show up minutes after you can still smell the coppery smell of blood and the smell of gunpowder in the room. And you're going to see the young man and the father screaming because he just watched his only son take his life. And in that moment, you're going to question everything you believe about the world. And you're going to, on Easter morning, in the early morning hours on US 19, go to the wreck when the mom thought she had to run out one more time to get a couple last-minute items for her kid's Easter basket and never again returns because of the drunk driver on US 19. You're going to go to those calls, and time again, you're going to question everything you believe about the world. And when we end up in these moments, it becomes burnout, right? And I'm not going to go into, there's a whole psychology side of this and mental health side of this, but what I want to draw your attention to is whatever faith you have, whether it is internal to yourself or there's something greater out there, or there's a higher power, or whatever terminology you use to describe it, you go through those moments of God has abandoned me, or the higher power has abandoned me, or he is so far from me. Or we get to the point that I wasn't right then in my early 20s where I said, if this is what happens in the world, I've seen 8-year-olds die of cancer, and I've seen 66-year-olds die of cancer, and on my son's first birthday, nonetheless, that was the day my grandfather died. And I thought to myself, how does God even exist? And you retreat from yourself and from your higher power. So I just want to, for the sake of time, encourage you on a couple things here. What I had to do, and what I encourage you to do, is remember, and there's going to be a little bit of repetition to this from what you heard from the other instructors and the others. But I want you to remember, and there's 5 things I want you to remember, but first let me finish my story. So my family, and we all go through it, in our early 20s, when you get to a point to, no matter how you grew up, you're often questioning life, questioning a lot of things. You know, I've been taught this, is it true, is it whatever? So my family knew that I needed some guidance. I needed to, in a word, find myself, if you would. So they've given me a great book, Wild at Heart. It is, the author is a Christian, however, it's actually made it due to podcasting very big in the secular world. Art Manley talks about it. Ryan Mickler on this show talks about it. So it's a great book, Wild at Heart. And that book absolutely changed my life because it changed my perspective. I'd grown up in a very liturgical world, in a very, this is the way it is, it's all black and white, and it helped me. And then a short time later, that image there, I went to a camp out in Colorado, and that helped me as well. The reason there's a Bible up there is because, specifically, that was my grandfather's Bible, and they gave that to me. And his favorite verse was circled in there, and on the funeral card it was written. And his favorite passage is exactly what I'm talking about here today. It talked about this idea of the psalmist saying, remember who's there to protect you. So the 5 things I'm going to go through just real quick are remembering our foundation, our victories, our purpose, our community, and our resources. So first of all, we want to remember our foundation, right? It's your why. It's why you believe what you believe. It's your foundational truths. It's what I grew up in, right? That was real for me, and I had to kind of get back to, okay, why do I believe this, and is this true? And there's nothing wrong with questioning, right? And so sometimes we have to ask those questions to get to a deeper part of ourselves, and I encourage you to do that. And not to jump to the end here, but I'm going to encourage you to do it now, because when these hard times come, when you go to these scenes, when you start questioning things, this is where we need to have started now. So learn what is foundational for you. It's those universal truths. Then we got to remember past victories. For us, it was the incident with my grandfather, and what we believe to be a healing previously, right? We had to remember the past victories. We had to remember the times that I believe the higher power was involved in my life. Even coming to this career is a whole nother story for a whole nother day. I was a landscaper before this. I put plants in the ground green side up. That's what I did. And then I came to law enforcement, and it's the craziest thing in the world. But it felt like it was what I was supposed to do, and there were things that happened and things that I felt were a higher calling directing. And there's been close calls in my life, and all sorts of crazy things have happened that I really attribute to being past victories. You know, so this is such an important thing, that to recall the blessings and the things that we know have happened. But also, and specifically to law enforcement, when you're in this career and you're seeing these horrible things, remember times that you were able to make a difference. I told that horrible story where I mentioned the horrible story of the father who had just found his son who took his own life. I arrived on that scene. That's an actual call I went to. And I arrived on that scene, and the father was besides himself, as any parent in this room can imagine. And he was just completely lost. And he was screaming, he was breaking down, he was crying, he was physically shaking. And nobody seemed to know what to do with him. There was multiple deputies on scene. Obviously, we do have some things to do, but nobody seemed to know what to do with that. And in fact, it was getting to the point that some of the deputies and supervisors and so forth were even kind of talking about, well, maybe we need to hold him under the Baker Act. Maybe we need to do something. What do we do here? Because he was going crazy, if you would. And I distinctly remember, and I'm not, obviously we're going to train you through the academy, and don't take this story as what to do. It's what I did in this situation, and there's a lot of factors and things when it comes to officer safety and stuff. But in this story, what I did is I ended up hugging him. I ended up bear hugging him. And it was specific to what was going on. There were multiple other officers there for safety and so forth. But specific to what was going on, I ended up bear hugging him. And to this day, I recall just him violently shaking in my arms. And then all of a sudden, there was kind of like a peace. He finally had that physical connection to just let go. And he began sobbing, and we were able to calm him down. And I don't know what happened years later, and I don't know any of that. But in that moment, I felt like I was able to be there to do something that made a difference. And what I encourage you is to remember those successes, those times that you were able to make a difference in someone else's life. Because not everything's going to end well. You're going to go to scenes, and it's going to be a bad night. You're going to be out there all night long, and things are just not going to go the way you would wish they had gone. Remember those moments. Remember your purpose. This can be existential. We're not going to go down that road, but by the time you're in your late 20s, early 30s to 40s, we should be getting to the point of kind of knowing our general why we do what we do in life in general. What's pushing you this direction or that direction? Why are we doing any of the things? So I want you to encourage you there, but also your why for law enforcement. What brought you in this career? As I kind of touched on a moment ago, that's a big deal for me. Even to this day, and some people probably laugh at it, but when I go to the range or I go to PAT, I've never been particularly good at those things, though I always do okay at them. To this day, I always whisper a little prayer like, well, you got me in this job. If you want me to keep it, you're going to have to help me pass this thing, because for us, those are all pass-fail. And I do it over every time. I've done it since I started, and I've been fortunate to pass them, and I'm still here. But to me, why I got in law enforcement is because I felt it was kind of like a calling. And when that calling's no longer there, then I'll do whatever it is I'm supposed to do at that point. So the first three that I went over are all internal, right? They're internal things to us. They're things that we kind of got to get alone and work on them within ourselves. So the last two, though, I just want to quickly, and you've kind of heard tidbits of this already, remember your community. So non-law enforcement social interaction, others have touched on, but it's so important. Keep friends. Now, that doesn't mean you only hang out with them. That doesn't mean you don't go to the occasional squad party. And that doesn't mean you don't have law enforcement friends, because that's in your career. You're going to have law enforcement friends. But keep those old friends. Don't be a cop 24/7. Do other things. Find hobbies. Maybe it's having a podcast. Seems like everyone has a podcast these days, so having a podcast. But whatever it is, find those things that allow you to have a sense of community. The importance of community cannot be understated. And personally, I think it's going to be one of the most devastating things that comes out of the pandemic response. It's just so important that we get together, just like the image shows, sitting around a campfire. I can't tell you how many stories I can tell you of moments in my life where I was going through a tough time and just sitting around, just talking, not about whatever the issue was, just talking has made a difference in my life. And then lastly, know your resources. The card that you're looking at on the left is actually a magnet that the agent that has phone numbers for resources. And these resources aren't shrinks. These resources aren't, you know, everybody gets, I don't know, we get really weird as cops when you hear these things. But these aren't those kind of people. They're chaplains. They're groups like Badge Wives. They're our CISM team for crisis intervention team. They different things that we have to help you out. And I encourage you to know where these are. Have a plan in advance. Just last year, I was going through some things, and I was like, called up the chaplain and said, hey, would you mind just riding with me for the night? You know what we didn't talk about? The issues that I was going through. We just talked. He sat in my car, we bullshitted, we went to calls, we talked about this, that, the other thing. Podcast inevitably comes up, it's just the way it is. And we go through all these different things, and the only thing we didn't talk about was the problem I was going through, and yet I felt like a burden had been lifted. And the same was true in 2019 when that deputy had taken her life. I didn't know her well, but you'll find that that kind of thing, especially working in close proximity, is going to affect you. And I reached out to a chaplain then. And again, we didn't really talk about the incident so much as we just talked. So know your resources and know that they are there if you need them, but to know them in advance. So in closing, Gandhi is credited as saying, you know, we all have this, I want to change the world. And that's good. It's good to want to change the world. In fact, the way it's going, I kind of hope somebody does. But we have to start in ourselves. We have to be able to remake ourselves, as he said. Recently, I had a great guest on the show. I encourage you to listen to this episode, Mike Acker. Very eloquent speaker, great story, hilarious story. But he uses the term live a life of design, not default. And that's what I want to encourage you about. That's what I'm saying. You know, pen to paper, and I know it's 2021, so finger to keyboard, finger to screen, whatever it is, but write down these things. Go over, what is my community? What are my blessings that I have, or the good things that have happened to me? What's my plan when things go bad? What is my why? Get those things on paper. Just take a minute, journal. Again, it's not religious, it's not spiritual, it's just taking a moment to live a life of design and not default. And then when the problems come, we just have to remember. Thank you, y'all.